Welcome y bienvenidos. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tony Cascardi. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities, and along with Jennifer Walsh, Dean of the College of Environmental Design, the co-PI on the Andrew Mellon Foundation funded initiative in the Global Urban Humanities. When we started this project, we really didn't know what it would yield. We had hopes, we had schemes, we had plans, but it's only now after the experience of several years that we're beginning to see just how incredibly rich a field or fields these are for exploration. And I feel that with this symposium, we're really beginning to reach something like a crescendo of activity. Jennifer is going to share with you some examples by way of show and tell of some of the things that we've accomplished in the program. But it's a lot of what we've been able to do has been in coordination with our good friends and partners at UCLA. So I want to say a special welcome to our guests and co-conspirators from UCLA, who we are in parallel with for a large part of what we're doing in global urban humanities at Berkeley. I'm especially interested to see that in this symposium, in the talks and the panels and the discussion, we're going to be getting a window into a city that is very much multifaceted, and that's absolutely appropriate for any city, and especially for Mexico City. We're going to be hearing and talking about the city as an art space, as a political space, as an economic space, as a space of revolution and change, as a space that evolves over time, and much, much more. But I will leave all that to the speakers, to our invited guests, and we'll now turn this microphone over to Jennifer Walsh, who, as I said, will have some show and tell for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I'm Jennifer Walsh, Dean of College of Environmental Design and the co-PI on the project. And I am similarly excited by today's events and just reiterate what Tony just said. I also want to say that none of the activities of the day would be happening without really superior expertise and organization by Susan Moffat, who will be talking more just after me and leading you through the day. But I want to recognize Susan because so much of what has happened in global urban humanities is because of her insight, foresight, and really incredible work. So thank you, Susan. My task is just to wave products at you that are for sale outside. And one of the things that we did last year as a group, and the faculty steering committee and Tony and I and Susan, is we decided to have a small competition for students who wanted to work in teams with the faculty advisor on a publication project, to give doctoral students and master's students the experience of actually working on and producing a publication of some heft. And heft is really what we got. So two groups were selected out of a fairly large field of proposals. And one of them is a special issue of a fairly new architecture student publication called Room 1000. Those of you from Berkeley know, CED know that Room 1000 is the top floor of the tower in Worcester Hall. It's where doctoral students have their oral exams. So it has some kind of, long legacy, and I think there are people who got their PhDs in decades past here in the room today that will remember Room 1000. For better or worse. But anyway, they put together a spectacular issue on urban pilgrimage from all kinds of perspectives with a faculty advisor. And that is this issue, Fat Issue, and it is out there in the lobby for you. The other project that was selected is called Participatory Urbanisms. And this is a really interesting project that engaged nonprofit organizations in the global south, in Brazil and in India, to have a conversation around participation, art, and social change, and urbanism in these two places. And the result was this fantastic conversation among practitioners, activists, and academics about the city, about making social change, and about art practice as a mechanism for social change on the ground. And they have produced both an anthology of essays about participatory urbanism that has contributors from around the country, from institutions around the country, academic institutions, and also all the interviews that they did. That was the other piece. They interviewed all the participants in both places, and so these interviews are in the second volume, and everything's translated into Portuguese, and also everything's side by side, so that you can see how the different groups responded to similar questions. Both of these works are on the live on the website now, so you can see them on the web with lots of visual material. And these volumes are also available outside. I can't tell you how incredible it seems that students working over a summer, and last spring and summer, have been able to produce such really innovative, incredible work. And I just want to give them a real round of applause. And needless to say, these groups are interdisciplinary. They span areas of the humanities and the built environment fields and really get to the heart of what global urban humanities is about. So, welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here, and I want to turn the podium over to Susan Moffat, who will guide us through the day.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad that you are all here with us. My name is Susan Moffat, and I've had the privilege for the past couple of years to serve as the project director of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. And I'd like to say thank you very much to Jen and Tony for their leadership of this really interesting enterprise, and also especially to the terrific group of faculty and graduate students who have worked together to bring 12 new team-taught courses looking at cities into the world. And we've really enjoyed working together on those. I also want to especially thank the students who have worked so hard for the past several months to make this symposium come together, especially Janice Choi, Alex Craighead, our tech chief here, Quan Nguyen, and Kushal Lachwani, and also all the many volunteer students who are here today. So thanks to you all. And I want also to thank Greg Chrysler, Angela Marino, and Maria Moreno Caranco, who brought together this amazing group of speakers here today. And it was their vision for the ideas that would be interesting to bring together that have resulted in the panels that you'll see now. Welcome to Dana Cuff and Jonathan Chrisman from our sister program at UCLA, also doing urban humanities. We've had some great generative conversations together over the past couple of years. And of course, thanks to Mellon for funding this project. Now, it's my task to orient you first to this building. The restrooms are that away, but also to the course of the day, and also to the widespread geographies that we're going to be looking at. The day is divided into three parts: Mexico in the morning, and then in an extended lunch hour, China, both Shanghai and the Pearl River Delta, and also Sao Paulo, New Delhi, and a whole bunch of other places. And then we will be back to Mexico in the afternoon. So why these peregrinations? Well, it's a combination of looking back and looking forward. In the lunch hour, when you'll be looking at the exhibitions on China and other places, you'll be seeing the work that the various urban humanities initiatives have done so far, our experiments in working across disciplines. And then our look forward is to Mexico City, when both the UCLA and the UC Berkeley teams will be taking students to do research in Mexico City in the spring. So what we're talking about today is really essential to priming the pump and asking the questions that the students will have a chance to explore on the ground. Just in terms of the exhibits, if you look at your program, there's a little map on the second page that will tell you both what is where. It also has a map of where we will be going to the reception at the faculty club at the end of the day. In terms of our panels, in the morning, we have Ruben Gallo giving a keynote on the place of ruins in Mexico City. It's always helpful to look back in order to look forward. And then in the morning panel, we will have folks examining modernity and process, creative practice, urban experience, and the city. And then in the afternoon, we're very excited to have a panel of working artists talking about insurgent cities, politics, space, and urban action in Mexico City. So for the most part, we're juxtaposing Mexico City and the other cities we're looking at rather than drawing conclusions or directly addressing connections. And we think that that juxtaposition will generate some discussions just naturally. But I think it's also useful to think back a bit, and in order to see contemporary Mexico City and, say, Guangzhou in context, we need to think back a few centuries to the days when Spain was turning the Pacific Ocean into an imperial lake, and art and ideas and ceramics and textiles and silver were moving back and forth between Canton and Manila and Acapulco, Mexico City, Veracruz, Seville. That circle of ideas and commerce and power is something that's been going on for a long time. So globalization is nothing new. And you'll see some really interesting mass-produced, hand-painted Van Goghs from Dafen Village. These are genuine articles in the exhibition called Art Village and City here. These were collected by Winnie Wong, who curated that exhibit along with Margaret Crawford. Those kinds of objects echo centuries of exchange. And so today, the movement of iPhones and auto parts and apps and artistic ideas that are moving among the factories and the studios that cluster along the many kinds of borders in China and in Mexico, these all harken back to the Manila galleons and forward to futures we haven't imagined yet. And even without going back to the 16th century, we can gain perspective by thinking about the cosmopolitanism of early 20th century Mexico City, when radicals from around the world, and especially from Asia, gathered to perform sometimes strikingly Orientalist dances of revolution and art and global politics. Part of our journey today, however, is not geographic, but rather a walk across the landscape of disciplines that we are bringing together in the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. Helping us look at Mexico City today, we have art historians, a literary scholar, a filmmaker, a theater director, and an artist, among others. And this terrific cast of experts was selected by a couple of architects and a scholar of performance. So this is what the practice of urban humanities looks like. So please enjoy our urban pilgrimage today and help us think about the way different disciplines can help us understand the cities of the past, the present, and the future. And after the symposium, please join us at the Faculty Club, which is a short walk from here, to continue our discussions. And as a special reward to the student volunteers, we'll have a little mini reception here in room 108 of Worcester with the speakers, allowing the students to get a first crack at some discussion there. So student volunteers and speakers, please gather at 108 at the end of the day. And if there are other students here who would like to join, that's great too. And then we'll all get together over at the Faculty Club. So thank you for being here. And now I'm going to introduce Greg Chrysler, who will introduce us to our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Susan. My name is Greg Chrysler, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Architecture and also the Arcus Chair for Gender, Sexuality, and the Built Environment. And I'm also very fortunate to be a co-instructor with Angela Marino and Maria Moreno-Caranco in the spring 2016 project studio in Mexico City. And we actually have some flyers about that at the back of the auditorium if you're interested. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Ruben Gallo this morning. He's been a real source of inspiration for us in setting up both the class I've been doing with Maria on history and theory of Mexico City in the fall, and also are thinking about the spring course. And I'm sure many other people in the room have been very inspired and influenced by his work. Ruben is the Walter S. Carpenter Jr. Professor in Language, Literature, and Civilization of Spain at Princeton University. He's the author most recently of Proust's Latin Americans from 2014, an essay about Marcel Proust's Latin American circle of friends in the turn-of-the-century Paris. His other books include Freud's Mexico, Into the Wilds of Psychoanalysis from 2010, A Cultural History of Psychoanalysis and Its Reception in Mexico, Mexican Modernity, the Avant-Garde and the Technological Revolution, that's from 2005, an essay about the Mexican avant-garde's fascination with machines, and two books about Mexico City's visual culture, New Tendencies in Mexican Art from 2004, and The Mexico City Reader, also from 2004. Ruben is the recipient of the Godiva Award for the best book on a psychoanalytical theme and of the Modern Language Association's Catherine Singer Kovacs Prize for the best book on a Latin American topic. He's a member of the board of the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, where he also serves as a research director. His current project is Cuba, A New Era, a book about the changes in Cuban culture after the diplomatic thaw with the United States. So please join with me in welcoming Ruben to Berkeley.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you so much, Susan, for putting this together. It's always a pleasure to be here at Berkeley, and it's a surprise to be reunited with so many old friends. You know, there's Minerva Cuevas, who I've written about and I haven't seen in many years. There's Tatiana, who was my classmate in graduate school many years ago. And there's Juan Carlos Rulfo and Jesusa Rodriguez and many others I'm very glad to see again. And I'm very glad to meet the China scholars who are meeting for the first time. So, let me tell you a little bit about where this talk is coming from. It's a bit of a departure from my work. You know, I've been working on Mexico City for the last 20 years. Almost, pretty much all my publications have been on Mexico City and mostly on the avant-garde culture from the 20s and 30s. And last year, actually earlier this year, I spent 4 months in Havana, living in Cuba. And that precipitated a crisis, I think a good one, and it's reoriented my shift from Mexico City to Havana. And what I did, when Susan invited me to give this talk, I started to think, well, what does it mean to think of Mexico City with Havana, or to use Havana to think about Mexico City? And I've been very interested in the evolution of Mexico City in the past 20 years or so. When I left Mexico City to go to graduate school at Columbia, Mexico City was this sleepy, blighted city, quite hidden. It was definitely out of the global circuit. It was a secret place where freaks would go to hide, which is an old tradition, that goes back to the 20s when people from Tina Modotti to Edward Weston, to many others, came to Mexico City. So it went from being this sort of blighted secret city to what it is today, which is a part of a global network of cities that includes Sao Paulo, Shanghai, Beijing, Bombay, and whatnot. And Mexico City is actually very proud to imagine itself as this modern metropolis that's part of this globalized network. Well, Havana is not quite part of that network. So I began to think, well, what does it mean if we think of these two cities together and make them have a conversation? So this is what I came up with. So last year, I spent several months flying back between Mexico City and Havana, I could not help but be struck by the radically different first impressions these two Latin American capitals produce upon arrival. Havana is a city in ruins and a city of ruins. Every single newspaper piece, scholarly article, or travel chronicle begins with what now has become a commonplace. an evocation of the ruined buildings along the Malecón, a meditation on the imminent collapse of dozens of colonial-era buildings in Centro Havana. And it's really become quite a stereotype, a commonplace. You know, if you look at anything that discusses Havana in almost any discipline, there's always ruins have a presence. And of course, the key figure here who has given us probably the most beautiful writings on this subject is the writer Antonio José Ponte, Cuban writer who now lives in Madrid, and he has two books that basically try to think through the theoretical, historical, and sociological implications of Havana as a city of ruins. You know, he has a book called Un arte de hacer ruinas, an art of making ruins, where he actually imagines that Havana is a city inhabited by this race of destructing beings, which he calls tugures, which one could translate as the ruinifiers, you know, or the slummers, you know, this race of people who have this drive to turn everything they touch into a slum. And he has another book, which was very useful for me in thinking about this, which is called La Fiesta Vigilada, the surveyed party. And this is a beautiful image for Havana and for Cuba in general, you know, which is the idea that yes, it's a party, yes, people dance and drink, but you have the state surveillance keeping an eye on the party. And I just wanted to read you a paragraph from the way he describes the omnipresence of ruins in Havana in La Fiesta Vigilada. This is Antonio José Ponte describing what, especially a few years ago, was a very common sight, which was ruin or buildings that were quite in rough shape that would suddenly collapse in the center of Havana, sometimes killing dozens of people inside of them. So Ponte writes, as the building collapsed, two of its columns fell against the window of the house across the street. If it had happened an hour earlier, they would have fallen right on top of a family watching TV in front of the building. The night guard who works at the butcher shop on the ground floor, in the early hours of the morning when I take a break from writing and look out of the balcony, I can hear the guard's radio. The guard, as I was saying, saw a curtain of stone fall in front of him, una cortina de piedra, un telón de piedra, I'm sorry. He saw a curtain of stone fall in front of him. It took a while for the dust to settle. In old Havana, no surface can be kept free of dust. A pollen of destruction floats in the air. A peculiar smell, it blended with the stench of garbage, endured until dawn. So I'd like you to keep this image of a random house in Havana in mind and this description by Ponte as we think of Mexico City. So that's Havana. Well, Mexico City, on the other hand, greets visitors today with a powerful image of construction, regeneration, reconstruction, and expansion. Building cranes dot the cityscape, and hardly a month goes by without the erection of a new skyscraper, an elevated highway, a segundo piso, a tower monument, or at least a world-class museum, such as the Museo Jumex, designed by David Chipperfield. If Havana's architecture represents the desperate state of a socialist economy in shambles, the ever-evolving skyline of Mexico City attests to the country's discrete but sustained economic growth that, as economists love to remind us, has turned Mexico into the 11th largest economy in the world and the second in Latin America. And actually, I'm quoting the official government position, you know, where these economic successes are always brandished as evidence that the country is doing quite well. Here's an image of that new Mexico City. This is the Jumex Museum, designed, very close to Polanco. So this is very much the image that a certain type of visitor gets of Mexico City, and you can see it's the opposite of Havana in many ways. It doesn't look like a city in ruins, it looks like a city that is thriving and doing very well. This is another shot of the Jumex Museum. Well, a closer analysis reveals that Havana and Mexico City might not be as different as one might think, or one might led to believe if one listens to official government discourse. All one has to do is look beneath the Mexican capital's glitzy appearance of permanent construction and globalized architecture to find hundreds of ruins, falling down buildings, empty lots left by collapsed buildings and failed projects that would be entirely at home in Havana. Consider, for instance, the Zócalo, the capital's fabled central square, bounded on one side by the 16th century cathedral and on the other by the Palace of Government. Next to this carefully choreographed urban plan of colonial power, this is a typical design, urban design of Spanish colonial cities in the 16th century, where you have the temporal power, the state government on one side, and the religious power, the church, on the other hand, and the polis, as it were, congregates in a space sandwich between these two buildings. So if we only look at the Zócalo, which is the neuralgic center of Mexico City, right next to it is a vast pit, a vast construction pits that interrupts the grid of streets, blocks, and churches that is the center of Mexico City, the historic center, which, by the way, is another aspect of Mexico City that is being promoted as making Mexico City a special metropolis in this network of social cities. Yes, it's modern, it has world-class museums, it has very modern infrastructure, but it also has this colonial downtown that turns it into a city that would be at home, that converses with European capitals as well as with other cities in the global south. So this hole in the ground, from the sky it looks like an open wound between the cathedral and the Zócalo, contains the remains of the great temple of the Aztecs destroyed by Cortés after he took Mexico City in 1521. The pyramid housing the temple was raised by the Spaniards, as we know, and covered up by a colonial-style building that stood at this site until 1978, when a team of archaeologists led by Manuel Gamio were granted permission to demolish it in order to excavate the site. Since then, the Templo Mayor has become one of the city's main attractions, as well as the capital's most spectacular ruin and a striking symbol of the obliteration of Aztec civilization. So actually, if we think of it, at the very center of the city, we have a ruin, just like in Havana. Might be a slightly different type of ruin, but we'll get to that. The Templo Mayor is only but the most visible and central of the city's ruins. There are many others to be found in the capital. Let's think, for instance, of Mexico City during the 1920s, a decade marked by some of the most original and forward-looking experiments in art, literature, architecture, and urban planning, many of which have been analyzed by Tatiana Flores, my friend and colleague, in her recent book on estridentismo. This was an era which is usually perceived, the 1920s in Mexico City, as quite utopian, looking forward, globalized in the sense that there was a dialogue with many other avant-gardes around the country. These decades, the 20s and 30s, are now remembered as a golden age of Mexican art, as a period marked by the leadership of José Vasconcelos as Minister of Mexico of Education, and by his tireless support of the arts, which led Diego Rivera to paint some of his most celebrated murals, and indirectly to some of the country's most avant-garde experiments in literature and in other tendencies that were conversing with Italian futurists as well as with other global modernists. Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, Tina Modotti, Manuel Maples Arce, Manuel Álvarez Bravo, Luis Quintanilla, Salvador Novo, Javier Villarrutia, Carlos Obregón Santacilia, Modesto Rolanda are but some of these names, that are part of this canon of 1920s modernism, which we usually associate with the spirit of expansion, reconstruction, building, globalization in the history of Mexico and especially of Mexico City. When critics and scholars, and I would include myself in this group, have remembered this period, they tend to emphasize the vast program that strove to transform Mexico City into a modern metropolis. Experimental novels and modern poems, modernist architecture and photography's new vision were synchronized to construct a utopian new world. And just to give you a few images, this is Tina Modotti photographing the new Mexico City that was being built in the 1920s. This is the Ministry of Health. And these are some of the images, which actually Tatiana has studied, of the a group of avant-garde poets and artists called the Estridentistas, they dreamed of a utopian capital of 20th century Mexico that would be called Estridentopolis. This was a modern, technologically advanced utopia that they only managed to sketch. But this is the vision that they had, a city of towers and antennas and new construction and whatnot. So that's basically the image. If we go back in time, the image that Mexico City presented of itself in the 20s. But when we think of this period, the 20s and 30s, most discussions tend to ignore a glaring phenomenon that marked the daily lives of Mexico City's inhabitants in this very period. The destruction left behind by the Mexican Revolution. A civil war that lasted 10 years left 1 million Mexicans dead and left a good portion of the capital in shambles. It is true that the capital suffered less than other areas of the country, like Morelos or the northern states, where entire villages were razed to the ground, but there were neighborhoods, entire neighborhoods in Mexico City that were reduced to rubble, especially after the so-called Decena Trágica, the 10 tragic days in February 1913 that were unleashed by the assassination of President Madero and that really plunged the country into a full-fledged civil war, which it was also a period that spread terror and bullets in the streets of the capital. All we have to do is look through some of the photographs from this period to understand the degree of destruction that characterized everyday life in the capital around 1913. Consider these two photographs taken from the Casasola archive showing the aftermath of the Decena Trágica. These are the kinds of images we have grown used to associating with Havana and not with Mexico City. Collapsed building, rubble sitting in the middle of the street, people gazing at the collapse of what used to be a housing, a series of apartments. For much of the 1920s, Mexico's capital looked like this, like a city that had been bombed, shelled, and damaged during 10 years of political assassinations, power struggles, and round-the-clock shootings. La fiesta de las balas, a feast of bullets, is the eloquent phrase that novelist Martín Luis Guzmán coined to describe daily life during the Mexican Revolution. And he actually has a section of his novel called La Fiesta de las Balas, the Feast of the Bullets. But even though 1920s Mexico City was an urban space in shambles, most of us, and I really include myself in this group, have associated this period with an optimistic expansion of the arts and architecture, with the construction of new neighborhoods like Colonia Condesa, with the introduction of a new architectural style that was in dialogue with international currents, with the erection of new ministries and new buildings commissioned by the post-revolutionary government. Why is it, I wonder, that we don't speak of 1920s Mexico City as a city in ruins, which is the way its inhabitants would have experienced it? And if we actually read the chronicles of people who were living through Mexico City in these years, including Edward Weston, in his day books, there is an emphasis on this destruction, this everyday experience of collapse that citizens would have had. So let me turn to one more example, thinking of this history of the way Mexico City has imagined itself. Let's jump to the 1950s, which is a period many consider the golden age of Mexico City in the 20th century. By 1950, the revolution was a distant memory. Architects and urban planners had been busy constructing and reconstructing the capital. Paseo de la Reforma had become an elegant tree-lined showcase of international-style buildings. The economy was thriving. The country had known one of the longest stretches of political stability in its history. And actually, something that is quite striking is that if you look at Mexican history since independence in 1810, there's no period as long as the PRI was in power from basically the 1920s to 2000, that has political stability and peace. There's no stretch of 80 years, that one can find without civil wars, without revolutions or some sort of upheaval. So by the 1950s, this was being promoted very aggressively by the government spokespeople, that Mexico had put behind this period of endless revolutions, chaos, civil wars, political assassinations, and there was a new era of stability brought in by the PRI. And this could actually be seen in the country's architecture, in the city's main stretch, the Paseo de la Reforma. In the 50s, President Miguel Alemán launched an ambitious program to expand the city's infrastructure, building, for the first time, a number of modern housing projects inspired by Le Corbusier's theories and executed by a young architect named Mario Pani. And Mario Pani is a fascinating figure. He was forgotten for quite a while. Now there's a wave of interest in him. There was just a show on his work at the museum in Monterrey. And there's a book that has just been finished by Pablo Landa, a colleague from Princeton, about this figure. He was quite remarkable. If you look at a map of Mexico City today, he would be responsible for the way a good fourth of the area of Mexico City looks like. He built vast housing projects, Tlatelolco, Unidad Juárez, Unidad Miguel Alemán, Unidad Santa Fe, which actually take, if you look at a map, it's a good chunk of the area of the city that was all designed by this architect who is now forgotten. He was quite fascinating. He was a student of Le Corbusier. He came back to Mexico in his 20s, and because his family was close to the president, he was granted these vast contracts to build these enormous housing projects, even though he was just a young architect in his late 20s. Pani was a man of boundless ambition, and in less than 10 years, in about a decade, he transformed the urban fabric of Mexico City. He built the 3 largest housing complexes in the capital and some of the largest in the world. Multifamiliar Miguel Alemán in 1949, Multifamiliar Benito Juárez in 1950, and the Tlatelolco housing project in 1964. This last one was so vast that it required raising an area of several thousand acres in the north of Mexico City, extending the Paseo de la Reforma to connect the new site to the city center, and it was designed to house over 15,000 apartments in several dozen buildings extending over several kilometers. And this is an aerial shot. This would be all of that rectangle is Tlatelolco. You can see it's quite a megalomaniac project in many ways. So what's interesting about this is that, I see once again a effort to present this image of Mexico City as modern, global, in dialogue with international styles, in dialogue with Le Corbusier, with other housing projects, etc. Pani conceived Tlatelolco, like his previous projects, as a triumph of planning over urban chaos, order over anarchy, and reason over insalubrious living conditions. His buildings conveyed the image of the new Mexico City, capital of an orderly, stable, and modern country. But curiously, the Tlatelolco project came close to being derailed by the return of something that had been repressed and which came back with a vengeance to haunt Pani. Right in the middle of the vast construction site, next to the 16th century church and convent of Santiago Tlatelolco, which had been incorporated into the design of the site, the ruins of another pre-Columbian pyramid emerged during excavation. Archaeologists believed it could be but one of the many buildings belonging to a vast necropolis that had been preserved underground, and pleaded with Pani and with government officials to stop construction. Pani compromised by incorporating the pyramid into his design, another gaping wound next to a church, actually sandwiched between a church and a modern building, which for many years was the foreign ministry. But he refused to alter his plans for an expressway designed to bisect the housing complex, which was built next to the ruin. And actually, you can see the expressway. You can see it right there. There's an expressway bisecting the housing project, and it goes right next to the basically eliminating for researchers and archaeologists the possibility of finding out what was in this necropolis. Tlatelolco was inaugurated to great fanfare in 1964 as a testimony to the success of Mexico's modernization. Most viewers and photographers were dazzled by the height of the towers and the modern motorways and paid little or no attention to the pre-Columbian ruin that marked, like a stain, the pristine modern surfaces of the housing complex. After its inauguration, Tlatelolco did not fare well. As we know, it was the site of the 1968 student massacre when the military opened fire on a peaceful rally next to the ruined pyramid and killed, we don't know exactly, but around 100 students. And 2 decades later, in 1985, when the city was hit by one of the strongest earthquakes in history, several buildings in Tlatelolco collapsed, killing or injuring hundreds or even thousands of its inhabitants. Pani's buildings, erected in opposition to, and indeed as an attempt to negate the ruin, had become ruins. Indeed, Pani would go down in history as the architect with the greatest number of buildings damaged or destroyed during the 1985 earthquake. Tlatelolco, a good portion of the multifamiliar Benito Juárez, Hotel Plaza, several office towers on Reforma, all collapsed either totally or partially. His architecture, one symbol of Mexico's successful passage into modernity, now lay in ruins, a powerful symbol of that vision's catastrophic failure. This is another housing complex. This is the Unidad Benito Juárez in Colonia Roma. And you can see these were friezes designed by the artist Carlos Mérida. This was taken right after the collapse. For those of us who lived in Mexico City at some point between 1985 and 1995, what was most striking was the persistence of ruins. A decade after the earthquake, nature's forces of destruction were everywhere to be seen. Where buildings had collapsed, empty lots remained undeveloped as miniature graveyards squeezed between houses and government offices. Yet, even then, the bleakest moment in the city's 20th century history, no one ever thought of Mexico City as a city in ruins. I hope I have succeeded in convincing you that after a close look, Mexico City is not that different from Havana. It is, and has been for much of its history, a city in ruins, a capital where collapsed buildings and empty lots left once the rubble has settled are as visible as the ones in Havana, a city in which Mexicans, like their Cuban cousins, have learned to inhabit and make a life amid the ruins. Even then, however, an important question remains. If ruins are everywhere, from the Templo Mayor to Tlatelolco, and if they have been a constant presence from at least 1913 to the present, why do most scholars do not think of Mexico City, like Havana, as a city structured urbanistically and culturally by ruins? And what difference, if any, is there between the type of ruins visible in Havana and Mexico City? What would it mean to argue that Mexico City, like Havana, is a city of ruins? I think one crucial difference between the two capitals might have to do with strategies of concealment. Havana does nothing to cover up its ruins. Quite the opposite. Some critics complain that the capital's ruins have been turned into a tourist attraction, officially by the city government. But Mexico City, on the other hand, as we have seen, has a long tradition of devising modern projects as a strategy to cover up ruins, from the erection of Spanish colonial city in the 16th century to today. I'm very interested in thinking of this image that you see when you go to Mexico City today, of this bustling metropolis, where things are being built, where you have something like the Jumex Museum and many other towers, as a strategy to actually conceal what to me is the essence of the city, which is the ruin. So I'm very interested in what does it mean if we think of this dialectic, concealment and exposure of ruins. So let me jump to the conclusion. But I'm very interested in sort of trying to bring back the idea of thinking of Mexico City as a city in ruins and not as this gleaming world metropolis that we are being invited to consider. In guise of conclusion, I would like to say that the dialectic between ruins and modernizing projects continues today. Those who have visited Mexico City in the last year or so will have certainly been struck by the vast number of construction projects, both private and public, that are in the process of transforming once more the city's skyline. More elevated highways, a new metro station, several skyscrapers along Reforma and Circuito Interior, new museums like the Jumex, new monuments like the controversial Estela de Luz, erected years late to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Mexico's independence from Spain. These are all buildings that have been erected in the past few years. But could it be the case, as it has been in previous moments in Mexican history, that this rash of modern and modernizing projects serves to conceal ruins? And if so, what exactly is the type of ruin that is being concealed? And here's what I'd like to go back to Havana and Mexico City. Since I started going to Havana, whenever I traveled to Mexico City, and this actually started before, I cannot help but being struck by a terrible contradiction. Never has the city seemed so wealthy, so modern, so globalized as it does today, a world-class capital. And never, at least not since the revolution, has Mexico as a country been so fragile, so threatened from the inside, and so dangerously close to a point of collapse. In the past decade, the war on drugs declared by former President Calderón and continued by his successor has claimed over 100,000 victims, among killings, kidnappings, and disappearances. Last year, as you all know, 43 poor students from the state of Guerrero disappeared. Their bodies have never been found. Their families continue to ask for justice, or at least for a plausible explanation of what happened. Drug-related corruption seems to have seeped into every level of Mexican society, from government ministries to neighborhood shops. Political analysts and anthropologists have described Mexico City as a narco state, a failed state, and they've raised the terrifying prospect that the drug money, violence, and corruption have really penetrated into absolutely every level of Mexican society in a way that makes it very difficult to go back. As we pore over these numbers and statistics, it's difficult not to arrive at the conclusion that Mexico is a country in ruins. As the case of Ayotzinapa has shown, the justice system lies in shambles. The same could be said for more ministries and government agencies charged with maintaining the well-being of the country's citizens. All structures designed to preserve order seem to have collapsed, like Panis buildings in the aftermath of the 1985 earthquake. So it turns out Mexico City is no different from Havana. It actually might be worse than Havana. Both cities are defined by ruins, but Cuban ruins are visible, Mexico City's ruins are invisible. And what's very sad to me is that Havana's ruins can actually be fixed. All you need is some money, maybe the end of the embargo, a bit of cement, and you can actually restore some of these collapsed structures. But how do you rebuild an entire society that lies in shambles? How do you rebuild trust, ethics, respect for human life in a country where even the most basic human rights seem to have collapsed? Where does one begin a project of national reconstruction that needs to tackle virtually every individual, every town, every state institution? Unfortunately, I don't have the answer, but I do hope that, I think the strategy might be to actually keep reminding ourselves that Mexico City is a city of ruins, and to actually resist, as a political act, the image that we are being sold, which is this image of a gleaming global city. I think at least that awareness and that effort to think of the ruin might be a modest step towards an eventual reconstruction. Revealing, as Freud taught us, is a form of shedding light. And there's a passage where Freud says, spirits, vampires, ghosts don't like the light of day. If we shed light, it's the first step towards getting rid of what might be haunting someone's psyche. And I was actually going to conclude on a more positive note by showing someone who has worked with ruins in Mexico City with the strategy of trying to reveal. But since time is of the essence, I'll just show you one slide. This is the collapse site of one of Pani's buildings in Colonia Roma. This is the Benito Juarez housing project. And when one of the towers fell down in the 1985 earthquake, there was this gaping hole left there. And for many years, it was this empty lot. So a few years ago, a group of activists, community organizers led by Paco Ayala have taken this site without permission and have turned it into a community garden. And they've built a organic vegetable garden. They do workshops there. They teach classes. They have daycare for children. And one of my favorite images that I saw in this communal garden, which is called the Huerto Roma, is this wall, which is being turned into a pond, and it's going to be planted with aquatic plants. And when I said, well, that's strange, what's the wall doing there? Paco Ayala said to me, that's the foundation of Pani's tower. It's the ruin of Pani's building. And to me, it's also a ruin of a certain vision of modernity, this clean, globalized, speckless modernity which has come crashing down so many times in Mexico City and is now turned into this. So I'll leave you with that to end on a positive note. Thank you.